If your organization was hit with a disaster or cyber attack tomorrow, would each person know exactly what their responsibilities were? If your answer is not an unequivocal yes, then you need a DR Runbook. What is a DR Runbook? Well, you're in the right place. It's the culmination of all the planning and designing that you did when putting together your DR system. When a disaster strikes, you should simply be able to pull it out and follow it. Every person in the org should know what their role is and who they should be communicating with. Our goal here is to turn unappreciated backup admins into cyber recovery heroes. So let's talk about how to make a runbook and what it should look like. This is the Backup Wrap-Up. Welcome to the show. I'm your host, W. Curtis Preston, and I have with me my celebration consultant, Prasanna Malaiyandi. How's it going, Prasanna?
I'm doing well. What are we celebrating?
I think you know what we're celebrating. My big new contract that I landed today.
Woo!
Very excited about that.
That's awesome. Congratulations.
Yeah, thanks. I'm going to be working a lot with a new company and helping them to spread their word about what they do. And we'll talk more about that in later days. But today is the day that I actually heard that I got the contract. So I'm super excited. What do you think I should do?
I think you should go for Korean barbecue.
By myself without the rest of the family?
Yeah, no, you're right. That's okay. Fine then. How about going and watching a movie?
Oh yeah, maybe I'll go do just that. I'll do that. Yeah, well, because you know, my wife's down in San Diego training to be a trainer to train poll workers. So she's down in San Diego with her mom, and the rest of my family is spread to the wind. So yeah, if I went to Korean barbecue, I would be going there all by myself, and they would never speak to me again. Given that,
just don't tell them. Do you think they listen to the podcast? Just don't tell them. Do you think they listen to the podcast? Do you think they know?
I just don't tell them. I would feel guilty. But I wouldn't feel guilty going to go see a movie because I do have the Regal Unlimited Pass, so I can go see a movie.
Do it.
So we've been talking about DR for a while now, and once you've decided, I mean, we talked so much about it. I think this is our 6th episode about, basically putting together a DR plan. You've got to decide what's in it. You've got to decide what your RTO and RPO are for each application. You need to decide whether or not you're going to do this yourself, or you're going to use a service. Are you going to do a cold site, hot site, warm site? You're going to use the cloud. You're going to use on-prem stuff. You got to make all those decisions, and hopefully you put a lot of planning into this, and hopefully you got a lot of input from the business, that this was not an IT driven. I mean, it could be an IT driven, I suppose, but just really, I hope that you got input from all of the stakeholders, all of the people that will be impacted by this DR plan, and that you put it all together to make all of them as happy as possible.
Right? You're going to be the knight in shining armor, right? When something happens.
Knight in shining armor. And this will date me, but here I come to save the day. No one's going to get that reference. Anyway, did you get that reference?
Mighty Mouse?
Mighty Mouse. Yeah, good job. All right. So when we've done all those decisions, basically when you have an actual disaster, you should be able to pull out what?
I was just going to say, you don't run around like a chicken with its head cut off, scrambling, and everyone just being like, panic, 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 panic.
Yeah, that is not what you're supposed to do. What are you going to pull out, Prasanna?
Well, what you're supposed to do is pull out your DR Runbook, which has been created ahead of time. Everyone has read, everyone knows about it, and you just follow what it says in the DR Runbook, and you're good to go.
Yeah. And I will say that, we're talking mainly here about disaster recovery. A DR runbook fits within a cyber recovery runbook. This is part of it. This is the actual putting everything back together part. If what we're talking about is recovering from a cyber attack, you do have to address that first. And we should talk about that. We will talk about that in other episodes. But at this point, basically, you have decided, you're going to restore your organization, and everybody should basically know just exactly where they're going, what they're doing, what they're not doing, who they're telling, who they're not telling. Because, DR, an actual disaster recovery does not happen in a vacuum. What do you think about that?
Yeah, no, it doesn't happen in a vacuum. There's usually other causes. And then it's also a very, very, very high stress event. Right? And so you want to make sure that you're not thinking on the fly, trying to figure out what to do, that everything has sort of been thought ahead of time, so you just can execute. It's like a doctor, right? And yes, I know there will be cases that you need to worry about, but a doctor, right? They go to school, they do the procedures, they know what to do, and so they are able to say, okay, I'm doing this, this, and this every single time.
Yeah, actually, I may have a better example to that, and that was when, I know I've told you the story, but I don't think I've told the listeners, and that is the time that we lost an engine on a plane when I was in flight on an MD-80. And for those of you that don't know, an MD-80 only has 2 engines, right? So we were on initial ascent, and we lost an engine. And for those of you that have never experienced that, which is probably most of you, if not all of you, if you've ever been in a car where you've accidentally and you're sort of accelerating and then you slipped out of gear, right? Like your leg bumped the stick shift or the what do you call that? The gear shift? I don't know. In an automatic, whatever. Basically, suddenly you find yourself in neutral. There's that sort of lunge that happens, right? And if you've never felt that, then I don't know what to tell you. But imagine that, but up in the air. So suddenly you're lunging forward and you're diving.
Yep.
You're rapidly losing altitude, and flight attendants are running back and forth. They're doing their thing. We were on initial ascent, so everybody was still strapped in and everything. And the plane did this massive like banking maneuver to take us back, and it was definitely one of those go around. And they because they got us back. They basically, as far as I know, they turned that plane around as quickly, whatever the tightest turning radius that you could possibly do. I'm sure that there were massive alerts that went off in the tower, right? The air traffic controller tower. They cleared the runways. We went back and we landed, and then the fire trucks came out, and that's when everybody freaked out, right? Once we were down, and then the fire trucks came out. Prior to that, everybody just sat there and white knuckled it, and and just just tried not to cry. My point of all of this was that pilot had done that hundreds of times already, because he goes to a simulator and trains for that.
Yeah.
And they had trained for all of this. The tower knew what to do. Why? Because they had a run book. They followed to the letter because they've got lives in their hands. They knew it. They had a checklist that they go down when you have to make an emergency landing with a plane that's lost an engine. That's just that, everybody just went and did everything that they needed to do, which I will say apparently didn't involve letting us know what the hell was happening. Yeah. That was not their concern. Their concern
because
was getting the plane safely on the ground.
Because there was nothing you as passengers could do.
There was one thing we could do. You know what it was?
Stop yelling.
Ah! Yeah. This is basically. All right. So and so that's why you want to have a run book. You want to have a run book. You want to train. You want to practice, and you want this stuff to be basically muscle memory.
Yeah.
And that involves who you notify, how you notify, whether or not, depending on who you are as an organization, whether or not you have to notify the media, whether or not you have to notify stockholders, all of these things, right?
Yep.
Law enforcement, depending on why you're doing this,
or your insurance company,
or your insurance company, your cyber insurance company.
Yeah.
Exactly. So I have a list. I like alliterations, and I made an 8-item alliteration for things that sort of make a good run book. And the first one, we'll just go back and forth with them. Okay. All right.
Yep.
The first one is that it needs to be authoritative. And by that, I mean, there needs to be one run book, right? There can be versioning over time, but when the disaster strikes, there's one place where everyone knows to go to get the run book. Now, the run book may be electronic, it may be printed, it may be on an iPad, it may be a bunch of different things, but everyone should know exactly where and when that is. And it may take different forms. There may be a paper version and an electronic version, but those two versions should match. There should be one authoritative version of the run book.
So how in organizations, and I'm sure this can be solved, how do you make sure everyone is going off the same run book?
Well, I think that's just a matter of
process.
Again, it all goes to training, right? Everyone just is continually explained, this is where the run book is, when it's time, right? And then whenever there are, the biggest problem / concern is if you're keeping a paper version of the run book, right? You have to make sure that when you come up with a new run book that you destroy the old paper version. Just realize that if that's the case, this is going to be a risk to the first thing, which is that it should be authoritative, right? The electronic version, assuming we're all accessing the same electronic version, that should be much easier because it's one file and you can control it. One file that's maybe replicated in multiple places, but one file.
But just make sure that you are aware, like if one of the disasters you're worried about is lack of electricity or flooding or other aspects like that, that you want to make sure it's on some medium that can handle whatever disaster you're looking to support in that area.
Which is why some people like the paper copy, right? I can't argue against it. It's just hard to keep up to date, right? And and you're going to kill a bunch of trees.
So the next one is accurate, which basically means that the runbook contains all the correct information. So you know exactly what servers, what applications, all the people, whoever is required. So if people leave, right, that it is constantly updated and it is accurate with what you need.
Yeah, that it matches the current situation, right?
Yeah. So here's a question for you, Curtis. Do you think it's worse to have a no run book or to have a outdated run book?
I still think no run book's worse, right? Right. If you pull out the run book and it says, please turn to Curtis and tell him to do the Humpty squat, right? And you're like, Curtis quit 3 weeks ago.
Yeah.
You still got a plan, right?
Yeah.
No, a bad plan is still better than no plan, I think.
Yeah. Okay.
But yeah. So the next one that I have is accessible. It needs to be accessible. We've talked about this a little bit already, and that is just make sure that no matter what happens, you alluded to that earlier, no matter what happens, make sure that it's accessible. To me, that would mean that I would have an automatic system where there is the authoritative copy where we always do edits. We always only edit here, right? And then that is then replicated via an automated system to all of the other places that are read-only copies. You might replicate it to an application. Maybe your company has its own application that runs on iPads. and that application is automatically updated every time you update the documentation. Maybe you do print out a new one. Maybe you figure out a way where you do loose leaf papers and you only reprint the pages that have changed and the new thing. You can do that so you're not killing an entire forest every time you update the DR book. But I do think that you need to create it in such a way that it's available no matter what happens.
And I think that last bit is key, because remember, if this is a corporate environment, say you don't have access to your two-factor authentication or your Active Directory, right? How is someone going to get access to the Runbook in order to be able to restore those services?
Exactly. What was the company? It was a big company a few months ago. Remember, there was an attack or a disaster or something, and they were locked out of the building. Do you remember this?
Yeah, it
was a big company.
Yeah, because their key cards, was it Meta?
I think it was Meta, right? They had an outage, and then they were locked out of the building. They couldn't get into the building because the authentication system was yeah. Don't be that person.
Yeah. So the next one is absorbed, which is basically, is your runbook understood by everyone in IT? Which I think a lot of people kind of take that for granted. They're like, oh yeah, I just wrote this. Anyone in IT should be able to read it. But can they really read it and understand what's in there?
Yeah, I think this is kind of about marketing, really, right? In the previous episode, we talked about how good of a recovery mindset does your organization have. And this is part of that, right? So how well does does the word runbook, if you said DR runbook, does everybody in your organization know what we're talking about? Because just like we want to make sure it's available in all of the different scenarios, we want to make sure that if only Steve is available right now, Steve knows where the DR runbook is. Steve knows he knows what the DR runbook is. He knows where to get it, right? And he knows how to not get an old version of it, right? So this is about making sure everybody's all on the same page.
And would you say though, Curtis? I know we mentioned specifically around IT, but is it really just limited to IT, or is it pretty much all functional heads should be aware of this? Because it could be touching them as well, right?
Well, I think anybody that needs to actually use the runbook.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, there are people in the runbook that you're going to want to contact so that they're aware of what's happening. They don't necessarily need to know too much about the runbook. I mean, would not hurt that they would know about it. So the next one that I have is that it needs to be active. And by this, just that it's very similar to the concept of accurate. And that is that it needs to be part of your IT change and control process. Whenever you add a server, you have a change control process. This needs to be part of the change control process so that it's an active part of your organization, that you're continually updating the runbook every time you make a change. That shouldn't be too hard. Again, assuming you have a solid recovery mindset.
Yeah. And I think for that one too, is that part of your DNA of the company, right? That has to be part of the culture of IT that says, hey, whenever we are doing a change, we have to make sure that, yes, this, and this, just like we always talk about, backup, go update your backup systems to make sure you can back up that new application. DR Runbook should also be updated as well. The next one is, and I know I kind of touched on this earlier, right, is adaptable. And this really goes back to everything in the runbook may not be perfect. Things may change outside the environment. The situation may change. And so you need to make sure that you have backup plans, not backup like data backup, but backup like alternate plans to make sure that you are still able to execute and recover your systems, even if not 100% of either the infrastructure is available or other aspects like that.
Yeah, it's sort of like, I don't know if you've ever read any contracts, but there's like a common phrase in a contract that like if any part of this contract is invalid, that only invalidates that part, not the entire contract. Sort of like here, like if you hit a single bump in the road and then your entire runbook is off kilter, that's not good. You need to, I think this is probably more about the practicing it and doing it, right? you get, and you use the, like the chaos monkey concept to throw wrenches into the works, to see how well people handle wrenches along the way.
Yeah. It's like your example you gave, Curtis, of your flight experience and losing an engine, right? Maybe the pilot hadn't trained for engine failure when on ascent, right? But maybe he was able to adapt and figure out, okay, yeah, this is where I'm going to do.
Yeah, exactly. So the next one that I have is auditable. And, this is, I think the best way, you've heard me say it a bunch of times, the best way to have your DR system tested is to have someone who isn't the person who put it together do the one that's actually doing the thing, right? So if you can bring in an outside IT person and they follow your DR runbook and they recover your organization, ominous dominus, man, you're the best.
Do you want to talk about your experiences with DR runbooks at the big bank you used to work at? I know we've talked about it on the podcast before, but
I know. Yeah, not everybody's listened to every episode. So, we used to do a full DR test every 6 months, and it was a really big thing. Like we shuttered everybody up for the weekend, and we spent lots of money doing these DR tests. And we tried to do it like this, where I had a lot of documentation. I had my run book out there, and they would go to follow it. And we defined a successful recovery as a recovery where the person running the DR didn't have to turn around and go, "So, Curtis, what did you mean by this?" Right? And by that standard, we never had a successful recovery during the 3 years that I worked there. We always recovered, but there was always some turnaround. And so that goes back to that adaptable thing that I said, right? But it also goes to testing more often. Every 6 months isn't good enough, right?
Yeah.
Every 6 months was the only way we could do it back then. But nowadays, with the cloud, how big of a fan I am with the cloud. But nowadays, with infrastructure as code and all these other things that we're able to do today, for many, if not most organizations, they could do this in the cloud and they can automate it. And that a lot of this stuff that we have to figure out in our heads could actually be completely automated.
Yeah.
And I pretty much alluded to the next.
Yeah, the next one, which is basically affirmed. So test regularly. Testing is the best way to make sure that your DR runbook is accurate and that it works. And I think just like you gave the example, Curtis, in the 3 years, you didn't really get to that level that you guys set. And that's perfectly fine. Don't expect perfection in your DR runbook. It will require tweaks. It will require changes over time. And that's okay. It's a starting point. It's better than having nothing, like you had alluded to earlier.
Yeah, agreed. So that's sort of the elements, if you will, of what makes a good DR runbook. Let's talk about what sort of the ingredients of a DR runbook, right? It's just
it's not just we set up the infrastructure and we just randomly run a DR runbook. That's not at all.
Yeah. So the first thing here, and this is one of those where the first thing is the last thing that you do, and that is you have an overview, you have an executive summary, and like a technical overview to just give everybody, in that scenario of like we lost all our IT people. Now you've got some IT people that are not your IT people, but they're different IT people, and they're following. So you give them an overview. As well as executive overview, you need to write this at the end because you don't know what you're doing an overview of, right?
Yeah, and I would say that a lot of technical folks might think, "Hey, isn't a runbook just here are the procedures that I do?" And I think these first couple that we're going to talk about of what goes in a runbook are critical, which will help you either in marketing or just to make it more complete for people who may not be doing this day to day. Right. So the next one is really an inventory. So all your products and vendors and the contacts for those. So what is your SaaS provider for email, right? Is it Microsoft? Is it Google? what is your account there? Who is the contact that you reach out to in the vendor in case, like, do you have a technical account manager, an account rep, etc.? So these are all critical things to document because you might need their help, right? It's not just, hey, I need to recover my own systems, but you might need help with recovering some things that are in their infrastructure as well. So just things to be aware of.
And there can be an escalation there, right? So, who is the person that you normally talk to at Microsoft or Dell or HP or whatever it is that, where you're buying your infrastructure, Micro Center, who is your normal point of contact? And then you should also, and by the way, you should have multiple ways to contact them, email, whatever you have. If you have, phone, right? If you have, their Twitter account, whatever. And then also like management, right? If you go to reach out to Steve and Steve, I use that name a lot. You go to reach out to Steve and Steve isn't there, then then what do you do? Because in the middle of a disaster, you may need some additional stuff.
Yeah.
You may need some additional hardware, storage, whatever. And so or you may need some additional expertise. I pushed the button and the button didn't go. Yeah. Who do I, where's my 911? Yeah. And you think what else would be there?
Yeah. And it doesn't have to necessarily be even your vendor. It could be an MSP, right? Your consulting partners, other folks as well, who are important to keep track of because they could be there to help you and assist you when you're recovering.
Right. Exactly.
Or it could be your cyber insurance company information too.
Yeah. We've mentioned them a couple of times in this episode. Yeah. The next one sounds very similar, and that is the contacts for the people needed in the DR recovery. What I'm thinking here is this is your staff, right? This is everybody. And again, we joked about it earlier, and that is that the successful one is one where we didn't have to turn around and ask for Curtis. Well, if it's a real disaster, it's okay to call Curtis, right? Well, not me, but because I didn't do your DR Runbook, but you got a Curtis in your organization. Everyone should have a Curtis in their organization. What do you think, Prasanna?
How about everyone should have a Prasanna in their organization?
Everybody should have a person who knows way too much about many random subjects. Yes, definitely. Definitely someone should have a Curtis and a Prasanna in every environment. So that's step one in your DR Runbook is identify the Curtis and the Prasannas in your environment. But yeah, this is contacts. And again, escalation, right? I reached out to Curtis. Curtis didn't answer his phone. Who do I call now? Right. Yeah. Who, you call, Curtis's boss and Curtis's boss's boss. Right. And also, contacts within the organization from here's who we need to keep,
up to date on
abreast of everything that we're doing, right? Management. And hopefully you have like a designated person in your senior management that you just go to them and let them communicate everything to everybody else because you're kind of busy doing the thing.
Yeah.
Right. And this is what back in the day, nowadays we would do it differently, but back in the day, this is what we used pagers for. We had an automated paging system and we would just send a page out to everybody. Everybody that was involved in the process got a page at every step of the process so that everybody knew what was going on, which means you need to maintain a list of all those pager numbers and all that kind of stuff, which of course no one has a pager nowadays, but
in my mind, as you're talking about sort of the escalations, I was thinking about your story about the Bobs.
The Bob, yeah. Toms.
Oh, Toms.
The two Toms. Yeah, the two Toms standing over the left and right shoulder. Yeah, that was a pretty funny moment where we were in the middle of an actual disaster, and we were, one of our guys was in the knock. And he was on speakerphone with the guy that was actually in the data center swapping tapes. And he said, "Oh, are you in the knock?" And he's like, "Yeah." And he goes, "So let me guess, you got Tom and Tom over your left and right shoulder." Except he didn't realize he was on speakerphone. And Tom and Tom, which was their boss's let's see, their boss's boss's boss and their boss's 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 boss.
Wow.
and they did indeed have, because this was a big bank, right?
Yeah.
So there were many layers of, so this was basically the CEO's second in command, and then the one after that, right? And they were standing over his left and right shoulder. And when they said this, they both just took one step back. Oh, good times, good times.
Yeah. So the next thing is really what a lot of people think about when they think about a run book, which is really the procedures, which are those step-by-step instructions on how to actually recover from that disaster. So this might spell out sort of, okay, what exactly from an infrastructure I need to bring up, what applications in what order, right? It's probably multiple sections because it's not like one big bang and you bring everything up in one go, right? So depending on what the disaster is, it might have multiple different sections with different procedures for each one, but it should be labeled, numbered, and easy to find.
Yeah, so you've defined, this is why I said this is the culmination of all of your efforts. You've defined the RTO and RPO of everything in your environment. And then you defined a recovery priority of everything in your environment. Mm-hmm. And so this is going to say, okay, let's say you've got, I don't know, 3 recovery groups, right? The stuff you're going to do the stuff that's got to come up before anything else comes up. And then the next set, which is like the stuff that comes up right after all that stuff comes up, and then everything else. And the first group is probably really small. Second group is probably decent size. And then the third group is probably the biggest.
Yeah.
Because not everything has to be up and running, immediately to be able to turn the lights back on. So all of that should be spelled out in the, you may also, because we've talked about this previously, you may also use completely different recovery methods based on the RPO and the RTO of different, parts of your organization. You might use a DR as a service product that does replication-based DR for your tier 1 applications, and you might use backup replications for your tier 2, and you might use, tape. Or maybe a replicated copy of your backup into S3, and hope you don't ever have to use it, for your tier, your tier 3 things, right? And all of that should be spelled out in all of those procedures. What else do you think? Any other thoughts on the procedures?
No, I think but this is where it goes back to that, what was active that we had talked about earlier, right? When you are making changes to your infrastructure, that's why it's critical that you go and you update these procedures, because when you need to execute, you want to make sure that it is accurate so you can have the best version of recovery, or best chance of recovery.
Yeah, exactly. And then our final step is escalations. And we've already talked about this, but nothing's going to go right.
Really, Curtis? Why not? I thought that's why we prep and plan and document. And
as much as I'm going to say, like an actual disaster recovery is much more like a rugby match than it is like a baseball game, right? Baseball game, it's like you got clear lines, right? I'm going to go this way, then I'm going to go that way, then I'm going to go that way, then I'm going to go that way. Or for the rest of the world, a cricket game, right? Or, rounders, basically, rugby, is like, it just seems to me, comparatively speaking, like a giant mess. There's an ultimate goal. We all have the same goal. But it's just there's this constant adjustment around, and so you need to have those lines of escalation so that people know. And also, there may be a point in your recovery where you need Tom to call the equivalent of the Tom over in the other organization where you're not getting any love, right? It's a weekend and your favorite IT vendor is not answering their phone, or they're not giving you the amount of love. You've contracted for a 4-hour delivery time of new hardware, and they haven't even called you back, and you're at like 3 hours. This is when you escalate on your side so that you can get them to escalate on the other side. And you've just got to have all those, all those numbers in there. And then I'll tell you what not to do. Here's another story. Today's about the stories. So we had an employee and she got handed this pile of tapes, and we told her, it's like, hey, you got this pile of tapes. At some point, Bank of America is going to call you, and they'll tell you what to do with these tapes. And she got handed the escalation list that came with the tapes. And after a few hours working, she decided she couldn't handle the anticipation anymore. So she decided to go down the escalation list to see if she could get an answer as to what she was supposed to do with these tapes. So, but I guess she wasn't familiar with how to use an escalation list. She just looked at the list and went. And so at 3:00 in the morning, she called the CEO of Bank of America at home and said, wow. I got these pile of tapes. Here. I don't know what I'm supposed to do with them.
No,
that's not how you use an escalation list.
Yeah.
that was my point of bringing that story up. So basically, that's the DR Runbook. I mean, it's putting down all of the plans and procedures and what to do when the plans and procedures don't work into a form where you can easily index and get through it and whatnot and follow it. I do think that there should be an authoritative one version that you're constantly updating. And then just make sure it gets, automatically disseminated to the other things. And you should be doing this frequently. You should be testing it frequently so that an actual disaster. So when you're doing an actual disaster, you're not testing just the DR plan. You're also testing your runbook.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. You're testing your team's ability to follow that runbook.
I 100% agree. And I think this is where it becomes critical, though. In technology, we typically do a poor job of documentation. Everyone wants to go build the cool stuff, put things together, and then they hate writing documentation. This is one of those things that'll pay tremendous dividends when you actually encounter a disaster by actually having a documented runbook ahead of time and following these procedures and doing the testing like you said. So instead of something taking, say, a month trying to recover as everyone's scrambling because no one knows what to do because they've never documented or tested, it's all documented. At least you'll reduce the stress level of everyone in the organization as you're going through this.
And there you go. Welcome to those of you that listened to this entire series. Welcome to the end of the disaster recovery series. 6 episodes. If you didn't listen to the other 5, go back. This was some good stuff. And Prasanna, thanks for sticking with me. And by the way, for those of you that didn't know, we're basically just reading from my book, which is Modern Data Protection. Which is from O'Reilly. For those of you that didn't know, that's who I was. I'm W. Curtis Preston, the author of the book, and Mr. Backup, whatever. So, thanks, Prasanna. Great comments as always.
Likewise, Curtis.
And thanks for those of you that have stuck with us through these 6 episodes. And for the rest of you, go back and listen to the other episodes if this is the only one you listen to. That is a wrap. The Backup Wrap-Up is written, recorded, and produced by me, W. Curtis Preston. If you need backup or DR consulting, content generation, or expert witness work, check out backupcentral.com. You can also find links for my O'Reilly books on the same website. Remember, this is an independent podcast, and any opinions that you hear are those of the speaker and not necessarily an employer. Thanks for listening.